The question is, would I do anything differently if I started over again as a new assistant professor? And I think the answer is no, I wouldn't do anything differently. The things that I did do seemed to pan out in the long run. So that included working very hard, which I value. I also really threw myself into the kinds of research questions that I was most interested in, and that was something that was a little different than the postdoctoral positions that I had been in before, where I was primarily focusing on, obviously, the kind of questions that my mentor was most interested in. And now I just reveled in the fact that I could do the very particular studies or the very particular investigations that I was really most keen to do. I got guidance from more senior faculty, and that was really helpful. And in fact, we have a buddy system at my university where the senior faculty serve as mentors for the junior faculty. And I relied on, colleagues, people who I'd worked with in the past, so I kept in contact with lots of people to seek their advice on how I was progressing, or whether this was a good idea or not, or how to keep moving forward. And so in the end, I think I wouldn't do anything differently. So the best career advice I've ever received. I think there's probably two bits of advice. One was from my PhD mentor, Jack Rackman, and his advice was to really allow yourself to be curious and intrigued by ideas and testing them out. So to maintain a sense of curiosity, I think, is how I would summarize it. And then the second bit of advice was that which I received from my postdoctoral mentor, David Barlow, who I remember one time clearly said, those people who succeed in academia are those who persevere. And I think that's so true, probably true for many different fields. But if you're willing to pick yourself back up and keep going after a rejection, after a publication doesn't get accepted, after a grant is rejected, and to just keep going, that will take you a long way. So, in terms of attending conferences, I would say the most favourite part is meeting up with old colleagues and friends. That's really the highlight, to sort of catch up with people, either people that you went to school with, people you worked with in the past, people you're currently working with on collaborative projects, either to talk shop or just to relax. So that's the best. The worst part of conferences I'm not too sure of, actually. I suppose it's sitting through boring talks, if there is a boring talk to sit through. So in terms of the RDoc, I think the RDoc has been a really interesting development. For many years I've been focused on DSM, and I believe in the DSM as a tool for clinicians. It has a lot of utility. But being trained as a psychologist, I've always been focused on dimensional approaches to psychopathology. Most of my research over the years has been based on dimensional approaches to psychopathology. And I think the RDoc is essentially a dimensional model. Now, yes, it has a lot of emphasis on biological mechanisms, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. I think it's a very good thing. Some people criticize that. But it also has an emphasis on other mechanisms, cognitive, self-report, and behavioral. And I really like the idea of having to think differently, that it's caused this paradigm shift and makes everybody stop in their tracks and just think differently about anxiety or depression or psychosis. And that's a good thing. It definitely has influenced the funding climate, but I see value in that too, because we're at a time where we want to be able to make leaps and bounds rather than little steps. And with the explosion of neuroscience tools and various other technologies for tapping into cognitive mechanisms and behavioral mechanisms, it just seems right to me that we would want to shift our focus away from traditional methodologies and apply a new conceptual framework. So the question about inhibitory learning and how does that become implemented as a strategy when doing exposure therapy is of course very dear to my heart. It's what a lot of my research focuses upon. And it's interesting that over the years, when I first was trained in exposure therapy, I was definitely studying habituation as a potential mechanism. But over the years we've discovered that fear habituation itself, while it most often typically happens, it doesn't seem to be a predictor or a mediator of outcomes. And so we've shifted to an inhibitory learning approach. And what that means is that when we're designing exposures, we design them around how can we optimize the learning in such a way that the experience itself violates the expectancy that the individual has, either explicitly or implicitly, and how we can consolidate the learning that comes about from that violation in the after period following an exposure trial. So for example, when we design exposures, we design it based on what are the conditions that would optimally define a discrepancy between what the person expects to happen and what actually happens. And sometimes that means erasing fear each step of the way instead of waiting for fear to decline. We might combine multiple elements into a single exposure. We might vary the exposure from one trial to the next so that it's not always following a pattern of repetition in order to habituate. We might build in occasional negative outcomes. We might manipulate context variables so that we can enhance context generalization. We're studying various other methods for enhancing inhibitory learning using pharmacological agents that have effects that do not influence actual fear level, but rather influence the encoding of information in such a way that it becomes more or less context specific. Following an exposure trial, even if the person's still very, very fearful, what we really focus on through a series of questions is helping the person to understand what did they learn? How did the experience differ than what they originally expected? How do they know that it differed? So we try to enforce the consolidation of the learning and the retrieval of that information at a later period of time. And for that reason, right now we're testing out methods that actually do not use any kind of cognitive restructuring in its formal sense prior to going into exposure, because the cognitive restructuring prior to exposure can serve to deflate the discrepancy between what the person expects to happen and what actually happens, so you're not getting that surprise or wow factor, and instead reserve any type of cognitive restructuring until after the exposure trial is over, where we can use it for consolidating the learning. So the question that was posed is, why does it seem to be the case that there's a stagnation in research on the topic of depression, but not on the topic of anxiety? And I think that actually is something that goes in waves, and that, you know, at different periods of time, a particular topic gains a lot of interest, becomes the hot topic of the field, something else diminishes, and then that prior topic resurges at a later point in time, perhaps related to new technologies or new methodologies. So I do think the anxiety field really took off a lot, first of all in, you know, around the 1970s and 80s with the introduction and real development of highly effective treatments in the form of exposure therapy and then cognitive behavioral therapy. And that was really a great push for the anxiety field. And most recently, anxiety has received another great impetus, and that's coming from neuroscience. So there's a lot of work being conducted on the neuroscience of fear and anxiety that is really informative for clinicians and clinical researchers in terms of how we design treatments, how we predict who's going to respond well to a given treatment, how we identify people at risk for anxiety. So I think anxiety is being once again fueled as a topic by those scientific advances, and I'm sure depression's going to, if not already, because it too is being backed by a lot of neuroscience now, that depression is going to surface as a much more focused topic. And in fact, as I said, I think that's indeed the case, because now depression is being recognised as one of the grand challenges for mental health, and that is surely driving a lot of researchers to focus on that topic. So what is my strategy for dealing with rejections? And as I said earlier, being able to persevere following a rejection, whether it be a paper or a publication, is one of the key characteristics of success. So my strategy for dealing with rejections is, first of all, to avoid. So I'll put the paper or the letter aside. Then I will do exposure therapy, so I'll pick it back up and look at it and study it. Then I will consolidate what I have learned and realize that it's not as bad as I thought, and then I'll go on and do it again. Yes, it is true that myself, Stefan Hoffman, Dean McKay and John Abramowitz are part of a secret group called the Presidents, and we roam the streets at night helping unsuspecting strangers who are suffering from anxiety. So the question I'm being asked at this point is, what's my take on the notion that anxiety does not need to be reduced before the end of a given exposure trial? As I mentioned earlier, this is actually a large body of my research over the years. So initially, when I first began conducting clinical research trials and doing exposure therapy, we began by the premise that you must keep the individual in the situation until their fear declines. The notion being that if their fear doesn't decline, or if it exacerbates, then somehow that's going to have a negative impact. And then it's interestingly back in the 1980s, when under the mentorship of Jack Rackman, we had conducted a study that kind of started to question that hypothesis. And in that study we allowed people to, quote, escape from an exposure situation at certain points of high distress, and then return to it at a later point in time, so that they were being prevented from staying in the situation until fear declined. Then Jack had done some further studies on what is the importance of habituation, and when I then graduated into my own assistant professorship position after working with Dave Barlow, I also began to really zero in on, is habituation, which technically means the reduction of fear, that's all it is, it's just a statement of the strength of the fear response, is that really critical to long-term outcome? And we found in multiple studies that although fear typically reduced from the beginning to an end of an exposure trial, that reduction was not predictive of long-term outcome, and in fact we've done a series of other studies that essentially prevent that habituation from happening, both in the laboratory and in fearful samples. And despite the fact that fear does not habituate at all, those individuals were doing just as well at long-term follow-up, which means 1 to 4 weeks later. And so I'm of the opinion now that the fear reduction most often happens, but is not the critical index of learning. And that rather than focusing on fear reduction as the primary guide as to whether exposure therapy is working or not, what we really should be focusing on is what is it that the person's learning, and how can we identify for them what is the key thing they need to learn, how can we design exposures that will optimally disconfirm their expectancies, that optimally helps them to learn something new, and how to consolidate that learning at a later point in time. So the question is how to keep patients motivated, or clients motivated to do continued exposures if their anxiety has not abated by the end of a given exposure trial. One way we do that is by the rationale that we give up front. So we educate our clients very much on initial fear reduction is not the goal. And in fact, for particular clients, it might actually work against them, because what they need to learn is that they can survive elevated anxiety for prolonged periods of time. And so to focus on getting rid of the anxiety actually works against what they need to learn. So we put a lot of work into the rationale. We talk a lot about embracing anxiety, and this is where some of the acceptance research that we've done comes into play. So leaning into anxiety, embracing anxiety, treating the presence of anxiety as a sign of success. That these individuals have a mission, and the mission is to perform a certain task even though they're anxious, and giving lots of reinforcement at the end of an exposure trial for having completed it, for having learned what they need to learn even though the anxiety had not subsided. So the greatest piece of advice that David Barlow ever shared with me, there are two pieces. I've already mentioned one of them. One was to persevere, and that by continuing to go on after having a rejection is the marker of success, and I truly, truly believe in that. I've certainly had that happen to myself over my career, and it's a matter of picking yourself up and continuing on. The second piece of advice that he gave me, and this maybe was less explicit and more in the way he worked with postdoctoral fellows and graduate students, was that he really conveyed to the student or the fellow his belief in them, and the idea that what they were working on has big potential. And so I think believing in yourself and believing that what you are working on can actually have the potential to change people's lives was a great piece of advice.